Welcome back to Inside City Hall. Tensions between China and Japan are on the rise after the Japanese government purchased a small group of uninhabited islands in the East China Sea from private owners last month for nearly $30 million. The 5 islands, which the Japanese call the Senkaku Islands, has been a source of dispute between the two nations for over 100 years. Joining me now to discuss his government's side of this fight is the Deputy Consul General of Japan in New York, Yasuhisa Kawamura. Thank you for joining us. Good to see you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Yeah.
Let me show a map, and you tell me about this area. This is a very, very remote area of the world. That's as close as we could get. We had to make our own maps because Google Maps don't even have these islands. I've heard them in some cases described as the size of a room or even of a double-sized bed, which I hope is an exaggeration. What's the big dispute about?
Okay, let me start with the issue. You just introduced the Japan and China have disputed over the islands past 100 years.
Yes.
That is not true. Okay, the bottom line is that the Senkaku Islands have been under Japanese sovereignty over the past over 100 years. Okay, so legally, historically, those islands were under the Japanese sovereignty. There's no question about it. So there's no territorial issue to be resolved with China over the islands. That's the very plain and clear thing.
Well, but it's fair to say, though, China asserts that it owned or at least had a claim on the island. They say that they had control of the islands from something like 1644 or 1611, you know, all the way up into the 19th century, hundreds and hundreds of years. And I'm not going to get into a legal dispute with you about it, but they're saying they have a sort of an ancestral claim on it. Isn't that the source of this dispute?
Okay, legal perspective is quite important when you talk about the sovereignty, which country has the sovereignty over a certain territorial part. Because in the modern international community, the law and the legal principles, legal procedures, so to speak, are the major kind of confirmation process in order to stabilize the international relations. I think legal aspects and legal procedures are quite important.
Okay, no, that's fair enough.
Let me say that. Okay, Japan first researched the area, those islands, and confirmed in 1885 that there be no uninhabited islands first, and then we checked also the trace of having been under the control of Qin dynasty of China. So our surveys confirmed that on those 2 points, no people, nobody was there, and also China didn't control the island. And just mention that the China controlled since the 16th century, blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
It's a familiar assertion, but there's no valid ground.
Well, but let me ask you this. What are the islands used for now? I mean, is there oil there? Is it a tourist destination? What's the value of these uninhabited islands?
Okay, since a long time ago, over a century ago, Japan owned the island. Simply because islands or territory is a very important component of a nation state. So we started from the ownership of the island from the late 19th century. Okay, 1970 or just before 1970, the China and other partner started the claim over the Senkaku Islands. It was the timing 2 years after when the United Nations Commission disclosed the possibility of oil reserves near the islands area. So that might be the possible a motivation for such a change in action. But up to 1971, from 1895, for over 70 years, almost century, there's no objections projected to the Japanese sovereignty over the islands.
But was it, if I'm not, tell me if I'm not right about this, but my understanding was that for the last several decades at least, it was owned by private individuals. And now that the government has bought it from it, now it's actually sort of owned by the Japanese government, by the Japanese nation itself.
Okay. Let me put it this way. The first Japanese government owned the islands. And then the private persons purchased it. and then government rented it. So peacefully and stably, those islands are under the Japanese government's control.
Okay,
we assure that nobody to set a foot on the islands in order to keep the kind of status quo and a peaceful and stable management is necessary. That's why we did it. And then there is the series of provocative actions, including Chinese vessels entered into our territorial waters around the islands several times, and then the concerns arose among the Japanese.
But let me ask you this. I mean, there are people rioting in the streets in China over this. There is political tension in your country as well. Ambassador Kawamura, you are a man of peace. Is this worth a single person's life, these uninhabited islands?
Well, the territory is crucially important for element of the nation. Having said that, you mentioned that the demonstrations, the protests, and violence. So I need to underline that the violence, acts of violence, should not be condoned in any country.
Is it possible that in both nations people are sort of being manipulated for political purposes? That there is concern about oils. There's disputes over or concerns about China's role as a dominant actor in the region, and that's kind of what lies behind this to a certain extent. I mean, is this can't really be about a set of uninhabited islands that, as you say, nobody really fought over and nobody lives on. So what is it? What's lying behind this?
Okay, well, I should say that diplomacy should deal with the difficult tasks back home at the same time, the relations between the nations. So the elements might be political and also economic or resources or whatever. So the bottom line is that Japan and China, I think those are the two biggest economies in the world, should understand that we have the broader responsibilities for world order and the economic prosperities.
Do you get to meet with your Chinese counterpart here in New York at the United Nations?
United Nations, yes, between the foreign ministers, yeah, we had bilateral meetings, and we also had the undersecretary level meeting towards the end of last month in Beijing, yes, after the serious incidents in China.
Okay, we're going to leave it right there for now. We have many Chinese and Japanese nationals, and we have many Chinese and Japanese American viewers, and they are concerned about this. That's why we wanted to take a look at it. Thank you for coming by to explain some of it to us.
Thank you.
Okay, we are going to take a short break. Coming up in our anniversary segment, we'll go back to 2001 and Mark Green's victory in the Democratic mayoral primary. Later on, we'll sit down with the new president of the United Way in New York, Sheena Wright. Stay with us.